The sixth book I DNF'd was... Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Just Another Struggling Writer, the beleaguered author's one-stop shop for commiseration and hopefully inspiration. My name is Carrie Scher, and I am just another struggling writer. Well, we've made it through another year, and as it is my first year on YouTube, I'm very excited to be doing my very first best and worst books of the year. I've also got some stats I'd like to share, as well as some surprises and disappointments from my reading year. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. So my stats are not super impressive. I just started getting back into reading and trying to read more this year. So in comparison to most other booktubers, my list is going to be on the shorter side. I read a total of 34 books this year, and that breaks down to a total of 7,271 pages read and 116.5 hours listened on audio. So I finished at just under 3 books a month, and if I had finished these last 2 books that I'm currently reading, I would have made that 3 book a month total. But on average, it took me about 22 days to finish a book. And unfortunately, I didn't get a single 5-star read this year, unless you count when I reread Pride and Prejudice, which is, of course, my favorite book, which I reread every year. But I didn't read a new book that I gave 5 stars. I got close. I gave a 4.5 out, but it just didn't hit that peak for me. And that is partially because I didn't read a whole lot, but also because I am actually not... I don't give out 5 stars very often. I can really, really like a book and not give it 5. I have to really, really just I have to feel a shift in my very atoms to give it 5 stars. And none of the books I read this year really did that for me. There are a lot that I liked and that I enjoyed and that I'm eager to read more from the author or continue on with the series, but none that really grabbed me and changed my brain chemistry just from reading it. That's what it takes for me to give out a 5-star. But breaking down my stats, like I said, I had 1 5-star, which was the reread of Pride and Prejudice, 1 4.5 star, 4 4 stars, 6 3.5, 7 3 stars, 1 2.5 stars, 3 2 stars, 1 1.5, and 1 1-star book this year. So that comes out to an average of 3.14 stars over the 34 books that I read this year. Again, not great, but I am just really excited to be getting back into reading, and I'm really looking forward to 2024, where I'll be hopefully reading at least twice this amount, if not triple, and find those 5-star books that I know are out there, that I know I have in my library. I just have to go and read them. So of those 34 books, I actually did DNF 7 of them, and that's a big chunk of the 34, I know, but I'm just going to go through them quickly and the reason I DNF'd them. The first one I DNF'd was The Obsidian Tower by Melissa Caruso, and this one was fine. It was trending to just be a 3-star, maybe a 2.5-star read. I just wasn't engaged at all. I didn't really care for the writing style, and it felt a little bit too juvenile. That is part of the problem with me and reading YA, is that it feels too juvenile, and even though this wasn't categorized as a YA, it felt very YA, and the characters' motivations and the way they were progressing through the plot just felt really, really young, and I wasn't really interested in that. At that time, I wasn't, if it was YA, I was just putting it down immediately. And even though it wasn't categorized that way because it was reading that way, I just set it aside. That might be something I come back to later. I do have another Melissa Caruso book in my TBR, so it may just be her writing style just isn't for me, but we'll have to see. The second book I DNF'd this year was A Ruin of Roses by K.F. Breene, and this is an erotic fantasy retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and it just wasn't very good. It took too long to get to the point, and it had just a lot of weird elements that I wasn't about, and so I just was like, you know what, I don't have time for this. I can read other erotic romances if I feel like it, or erotic fantasies if I feel like it. The third one I DNF'd was The Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan, and I know this is the first book of a very popular, very long series. I just couldn't get into it. That was actually the third time I had tried to read it, and there's just something about the writing style that I wasn't clicking with. I hate to go back and try and give it a fourth try. There's just certain times where I feel like it takes up too much space in the genre for me to ignore. And I didn't get very far, only 30 pages. Like I said, at the beginning of the year, I was DNFing at the drop of a hat. I wasn't interested in spending any time on books I wasn't enjoying. But again, I think this is something that I may have to come back and try again and push through, because I'm such a harsh critic that I feel like I could be throwing away books that I may later enjoy just because of one or two little niggling things. I don't want to be that kind of reader. I want to read very widely, and I can't just DNF books just because a character didn't react appropriately in the way that I would have written it. You know, that's just not a good reason to stop reading something. So I'm going to try and get back into that one. I don't know how long it'll be. Again, that would be my fourth attempt to read it. Sometimes you just have to push through just to experience something that is so widely known in the genre. The fourth book I DNF'd was Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill, and this was a indie published book that is actually got quite a significant audience and group of fans. I just didn't like it. The writing style was not for me. I was at 40% and it felt like nothing really had happened. And then there was a character death that was related to the main character. And again, it just felt like blown past in the course of one page, and then they had to move on to, you know, other things that were happening. And I guess that means I'm more of a character driven like reader, where I need characters to really absorb these character deaths in ways that I feel is realistic, regardless of the surround. I don't know. But I was at 40% and I was just like, how has nothing happened yet? I'm at 40%. And it just wasn't for me. And again, I regret that, because it's got quite a few fans and readership based on, you know, even for an indie published book, but I just didn't care for it. In a similar vein, the fifth book I DNF'd was 11th Cycle by Kian and Ardalan. And this is another self-published book that just needed an editor really bad. It was my understanding that the author knew English as a second language, and so that was pretty apparent in some of the writing, and it just needed an editor. It was also extremely long, and I felt like with how things were progressing, it was going to be too long. It was going to drag a lot. And again, I want to support indie authors. I just feel like there needs to be some quality control in the indie publishing sphere that a lot of people just kind of blow past in their eagerness to be published. And I don't begrudge them that. I can definitely see why that is an attractive option as an aspiring author myself. But there are just times where an editor is not a nice idea. It's a necessity to produce a quality book. And in this case, it was in dire need of a second set of eyes. The sixth book I DNF'd was Jade City by Fonda Lee. And I'm so sorry, but this book was just not meant for me. It was not meant for me. I don't like these kinds of stories. I don't like anti-hero based stories. I don't like books about bad people. I don't like the crime family mafia thing. I can see the appeal for other people. I am not one of those people that it appeals to at all. And the writing was excellent. The setting, excellent. I would definitely read more from Fonda Lee, but not this series. It was not for me. And again, I want to like it so bad. I want to be part of that group that just loves this series, but I'm not one of the people. This is not for me. This is not meant for me. This is not my genre. This is not up my alley at all. The thing I say the most in like the media that I consume is I don't want to be depressed in my spare time. Like, I deal with that enough in my everyday life. I like to read to feel good. And while I can read books that have darker tones and themes, I need there to be some hope, and I need there to be some goodness. And when the whole basis of the story is about the mafia and the crime family and all this stuff, and the only good character that was keeping me going gets whacked, I was just like, I'm sorry, I just can't proceed if this other character is now going to be the protagonist. If you know, you know, but I That was when I set it down. I was like, this isn't for me. I'm not going to enjoy it. It wasn't for me. There's no other way to say it. So I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I know this is a pinnacle of this genre. And again, this is the third time I had tried to read it, and I was determined to get all the way through it this time because it is so popular. I know when to say that I am not the target audience. I am not someone who enjoys these kinds of stories, and it is no discredit to the people who like it or to Fonda Lee herself. It just wasn't for me. And the last book I DNF'd was Camber of Cooley by Katherine Kurtz. I just talked about this on my fall reading wrap up. It is a book from the 80s that felt like it was from the 80s. It was very dated, and the writing was very dry, and I didn't care. There was a major character death again around the 30% mark, and I was just like, why am I reading this? I felt like I didn't care enough about the consequences of that character death, and that is at the moment where I was like, I have other things I can't be reading. I was in the middle of a blitz trying to read as many books as I can before the end of the year, and I just didn't feel like I had the time or mental energy to waste on that because it did. It felt like a drag every time I opened the book. So I'm going to talk about my biggest surprise and my biggest disappointment. And next year, I hope that this is going to be a little bit of a longer list. But since I only have 34 books to talk about, I'm going to do one of each. Okay, so my biggest surprise was Lord of Stariel by A.J. Lancaster. And this is a romantasy that's super cozy. It's about a woman who has left her family's estate to go off and live on her own because she is more of a modern woman. It's basically a time where women are not expected to do much. It's not really approved of that they can do magic and can do all these other things. And she's more modern. So she goes and moves away to the city, kind of live her own life, and she leaves her family behind. But her father passes away and she has to come back to the estate where her family lives for the estate to be inherited by the next person. And this particular estate is very unusual in that it is magical and it chooses its next lord by this like little ritual that they do. And it's not like father to son or mother to daughter. It's just whoever the land feels most connected to. And so she goes back and is really just there for the funeral and for the choosing, and of course ends up being chosen, which is a huge surprise to her because she's been gone for so long and she never really felt especially connected to Stariel. And from there, everything kind of goes off the rails. And I don't know, this book just came to me at the right time. It was super cozy and just super like very low fantasy. The magic of the land and our main character Hedda's magic just felt very low key, not really a super big part of the story. That's exactly what I wanted. It was exactly what I needed. The romance was part of it, but it wasn't overpowering. And it was just a cute little story about this woman who is trying to find her place back in her home and feeling the jealousy of the men who felt like they were going to be chosen, while also courting, receiving advances from her neighbor, and also like having feelings for the servant boy who grew up with her, who is now like the butler and is obviously really attracted to her. And so it was just came to me at the right time. I just loved it so much. It was such a surprise. I got it for free on the Audible store. Like I said, I wasn't expecting much. I just had it because I needed something to listen to in the car to add to my reading total. And it was just great. I just loved it. I actually went and like immediately as soon as I finished it, picked up the remaining 3 books in the series. It was just nice and cozy and really low state and perfect for when you need it, because at the time I really did. I needed something that wasn't super heavy on me. It's just something fun and cozy to get me through, and that was exactly what it was. So I ended up giving that book 4 stars. It was such a pleasant surprise. So my biggest disappointment might actually come as a bit of a surprise because I see this a lot as something that a lot of booktubers really loved. But for me, it wasn't about the book itself. It was about its marketing and what I was expecting going into it. And that is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. And again, this book wasn't bad. In fact, if I had gone in with the correct expectations, I probably would have rated this higher. But it was marketed to me as a fantasy. And spoiler alert, it's in no way a fantasy. It is completely contemporary. It is kind of gothic literature, but it's contemporary, and there's no magic in it at all. I think they want you to think that there might be some magic, but there's not. And for me, that was really disappointing. I am trying to read as much fantasy as possible. I love fantasy, it's my favorite genre. I don't read contemporary or gothic fiction for a reason. And so this felt like I was sold a bill of goods that I did not receive. And again, like I said, if I had the correct expectations, I might have enjoyed it. But I kept, every page I turned, I was just waiting for the switch to flip, and it never did, and it just ended up being a huge letdown. So while the book is like the writing is very good, and like kind of the central mystery of the story was really compelling, just the fact that it was not marketed correctly, at least to me, I ended up being really disappointed, and I think I gave it 3 stars. All right, I am going to now talk about my top 3 books of the year. Coming in at number 3 is Shadow of the Gods by Gwynne, and this was just a very good, well-written, classic fantasy story inspired by Nordic tradition and Nordic folklore. Oh my gosh, this was so good. This was so good to listen to. It was a completely new brand of fantasy. I hadn't read anything Norse-inspired before, but it was so good. We follow 3 different characters that are on different quests and journeys of their own. First is Orca, who is a woman whose son is kidnapped and her husband murdered at the beginning of the book, and then she goes on a quest to recover her son and avenge her husband's death. And we also follow Varg, who is a former slave who ends up in a company of mercenaries. And the third POV character we have is Elvar, who is the daughter of a Jarl who is very powerful and has a lot of plans for her, but she does not want what he wants for her, so she leaves and joins a separate mercenary company to try and prove herself as a warrior and kind of make her own way. They are all navigating this disdain kind of magic where people have powers of the gods, and if you have that kind of magic, you are a lower class, you are treated as a slave or vermin or outright killed. Then Orca's got these kidnappings going on. Her son is not the only one who has been abducted, trying to figure out what's going on there. And it was just, oh my gosh, it was so good. It was so good. And the reveal at the end was excellent. I'm really looking forward to getting back into the series. I do like to take a little bit of time in between each entry of a series, but this is definitely on my list of something I want to continue in this coming new year. It was very good. I gave this one 4 stars. Coming in at number 2 of my best books of the year was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I actually reviewed this on my short-lived podcast that I started at the beginning of this year. And if you listen to the podcast, you would think that I didn't like it at all because I had a lot of criticisms about it in terms of one of the POV characters, actually 2 of the POV characters, and the way one of their arcs was written entirely. And just the reveal at the end was a non-reveal. It was pretty obvious throughout the whole book and things of that nature. And yet I still gave it 4 stars because it was so well written. The characters were so compelling. Shiala, the pirate captain, half mermaid, she was like one of my favorite characters that I got to follow out of the entire year. And even though I wasn't really compelled to pick up the sequel, as I've been sitting on it and thinking about it, I think I probably will, just because I did like this book despite all of those criticisms. I don't know. I just think there are times where even though there are disappointments in a book, other things like the writing and the character work can carry you through those disappointments. The setting was great, and just the lore and everything. There's non-binary characters, and again, Shiala, she's a queer character. So, and it's set in Central American-based fantasy world, which you don't often see represented. So that was a really great taste of this new kind of perspective. It was so good. It was so good, even with the character who was introduced way too late as a POV and contributed almost nothing, and the character who I thought was intensely boring and had the potential for the most interesting end be taken away from me at the end. Anyway, just lots of things that I wouldn't have done that I didn't really care for, but still am willing to kind of ignore and see where the story goes because the other 2 characters were so good. So I ended up giving that 4 stars, even with all of those criticisms. That's how good the book was. 4 stars. All right, and my best book of the year is The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. This is a Middle Eastern inspired fantasy based on 1001 Arabian Nights. Oh my gosh, it was so good. I loved it. I loved all of the characters. I love the kind of progression of the story. I love the conflict. I love the setting. I love the tie-ins with the real world mythology and the source material. I loved it all. This book was what I had hoped to get when I read City of Brass by S.H. Chakraborty. I mentioned in my last video that that book ended up kind of disappointing me. I really didn't like one of the main characters. And it's funny because in The Stardust Thief, there is a very similar character to the one I didn't like in City of Brass, but in Stardust Thief, it worked for me. It felt like his flaws were flaws. You know, they weren't being hidden. They weren't being played up as an actual virtue. They were real flaws, things that he acknowledged, things he had to work on. And he wasn't like, I hate it when a flawed character is portrayed as an inherently heroic one with no problems at all. I hate that. And so I loved all the characters. The entire cast was great. The relationship between the main character and her djinn bodyguard slash almost like a father figure was so good, was so excellent. I love the progression of how she finds out more about him and his history, despite the fact that they've been together for so long. I love where everything is going. I'm so excited for the sequel, which is supposed to be out next year. That is something that I'll be picking up on day one and reading right away. And that is something I don't do very often, but I am super excited. I love this book so much. I gave it 4.5 stars because, again, it just didn't hit that final level for me, but it was so very, very good. All right, and at last, the moment we've all been waiting for, my bottom 3 books of the year, my worst books that I read this year. Starting in hot at number 3, we have An Alchemy of Masques and Mirrors by Craddock. And this is kind of a steampunky story that features airships and things like that. And the world they're in, they're like floating islands. And it's kind of like, sounds like it's like a gas giant, but you know, everything underneath is just, there's nothing but gas. And so I really, really love the setting. Really cool. It's also very heavily based on real world European countries. There's obviously an analog to Spain and France and England, and very, very obviously based on Europe. The problem is that this book, because of those European influences, it's very, very anti-feminist in terms of like their society is very much in the old age where women are born to be married. And the other big thing is that the religion in this setting is very discriminatory of any physical differences that children may be born with. In fact, those born with physical differences are often just murdered outright. And our main character is a woman who was born with a limb difference, and she was inadvertently saved by a musketeer, essentially. And her whole life has basically been a curse because she is looked at as blasphemy. Just her existence is blasphemy. And she's roped into this political plot where she, despite this limb difference and despite her social status, she's looked at very, very negatively. She has somehow been promised to be wed to a prince of another country. That's the central mystery, is who arranged this? Why did they arrange this? You know, what is the ultimate goal? The political intrigue. And the political intrigue was probably my favorite part. I love that. I love reading that in fantasy stories. I just couldn't get past the ableism and the misogyny. And I know that's part of the setting, and it's something that's not celebrated or romanticized, but it's also not, it was not portrayed sensitively either. At the end of the story, the character with the limb difference does get like a magical like substitute, which is gross. She ends up actually possibly falling for the prince she was supposed to get married to anyway. And so like it felt like a lot of the messages that maybe were the author might have been going for were ended up subverted anyway. And I hated it. I hated it. I hated the ableism so much. I don't have a limb difference, and I was viscerally uncomfortable reading this book. I do not recommend it for anyone with a limb difference or anyone with sensitivities to that kind of ableism. And the misogyny was also just, my whole thing was when I was thinking about this book was why do we still need to write books like this? Why are we still need to write books about just horrible, horrible misogyny that is in no way challenged, in no way subverted, and, at the end almost accepted? I don't understand why we need to be still writing these into our books. So I gave An Alchemy of Masques and Mirrors 2 stars. All right, the second worst book I read this year shouldn't be any surprise. It is Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. This book made no sense. The magic system was treated as a given, even though it was stated in text that not everyone had this ability. And then the body hopping was, I don't even want to say skirted the bounds of consent. It outright flouted them and actually tried to excuse not getting consent. And that was really gross. And the romance is extremely nonsensical, extremely rushed, extremely there's no chemistry between the main characters whatsoever. And this is supposed to be a book about Antony and Cleopatra and unhealthy obsession, but I didn't even get unhealthy obsession from them, which is what I wanted. I don't mind a romance that is toxic and bad and ultimately the downfall of the characters, but this wasn't that. It was just bad. I didn't see the obsession or the romance or the chemistry or anything. It was just bad. And then when you bring in the absolute disregard for consent, when you are hopping into another's body and then using that body to have sex with someone, that's not okay. And you can't sit there and tell me on the page, well, in this world, bodies are like accessories and people throw them away all the time, when not everyone has the ability to body hop. For some people, for a lot of people in this world, their bodies are permanent and they cannot be used as accessories. And so even if they've been conditioned to think that they can have their consent taken away at any time, does not make that okay. Doesn't make it, it's just, and I don't feel like maybe that's the point the author was trying to make, but she didn't ultimately make it. So I just hated it. I hated it. And I hate that we have to have this conversation again in 2023. And lastly, again, no surprise here, my worst book of the whole year was A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I've talked about it. I did a whole review and I just talked about it last week. I did a whole review of it and I just talked about it in my last video. This book was not meant for me. This is a vampire romance book that came out in the post-Twilight craze. I was never in that audience to begin with, and it was definitely not up my alley. It was just frustrating to read something that had a potential for a plot only to be used to prop up the central romance that was resolved by the 50% mark, which means we had 300 pages of just making moon eyes at each other and just talking about how much they love each other and how much they do anything for each other and roping in their entire family into supporting this. It's just there was nothing, there was no plot structure, there was no stakes whatsoever, and then you add in the fact that the main character is completely insufferable and the main love interest is misogynist and their relationship is based on patriarchal tropes that are not challenged and are often celebrated, and it was just gross. I hated it. I don't recommend it to anyone, not even to readers who might have liked it, because I just don't feel like this is a good book. You have to have a plot structure and you have to have conflict and you have to have tension, and this book had none of that. It just had two characters coming together and then staying together without any sort of conflict or impediment or anything in their relationship for 600 pages. I was not a fan. I hated it. This is my lowest rated book of the year at 1 star. I would have DNF'd it at 43% if I had not decided that I needed to go ahead and finish it so I could give a full review of it. I wish I could scrub it from my brain. Actually, I don't think that, because then I might be tempted to read it again, not knowing what it was about, and I would have to go through that again. So no, I don't wish I could scrub it from my brain. I just wish that it would go away. And that is all I have for you. Those are my worst books of the year, my best books of the year, my surprises and disappointments, and all the books I DNF'd, as well as some stats. I hope next year to have a greater list for you guys. I hope to read at least double, if not triple, the books in 2024 and get just kind of a wider experience. And I'm also seeking a 5-star read, which, as you will see in my next video, I anticipate starting off with in January, a 5-star read. So if you're interested to know what book I've chosen for next month to go ahead and read, hopefully as my 5-star, you can check out my next video on the 1st of January, kind of outlining my reading plans and my TBR. And that's pretty much everything I have for you. Thank you so much for watching. As always, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.